The northwest frontier was never a place where the British Empire could relax. No matter how powerful it was elsewhere, this was the one region that constantly kept it on edge. It was a critical line of defense for the British Empire within the Indian subcontinent. Beyond the northwest frontier lied Afghanistan, which acted as a buffer between two rival empires, the mighty British Empire and the Russian Empire. The two were locked in what was called as the Great Game, both watching each other and waiting for an opportunity to take control of the strategic regions of Afghanistan. The real challenge, however, was the land and the people. The frontier itself was tough, with rugged mountains and broken terrain. The region was also heavily fragmented in terms of culture, politics, and regional identities. Scattered across those mountains were fiercely independent and very well armed tribes. For the British, this resulted in a constant balancing act. On one hand, there was the looming fear of Russian invasion through Afghanistan. On the other, there was a constant tribal resistance by Pathans and other tribes that was proving to be very exhausting to deal with for the British Indian Army. A big part of the British strategy at this time was shaped by the Russian threat. What if the Russian Tsarist forces decide to push through Afghanistan and into the subcontinent? And because of this, Britain went to great lengths to keep Afghanistan within its sphere of influence and out of Russia's reach. In an effort to negate this threat, the British made numerous attempts at imposing their will upon Kabul, and over the course of the 19th century, this strategy led to three separate Anglo-Afghan wars in 1838, 1878, and in 1919. In 1893, the British coerced the Afghan Amir into delineating Afghan and British spheres of influence along the Durand Line. This was done in an effort to limit the Afghan transporter meddling. Its effect, however, was very different than anticipated. The Northwest Frontier Province developed into two very different areas. To the west of the administrative border were the mountains, which were loosely controlled political agencies. To the east were the settled, fully administrated districts of the fertile Indus Plain. To maintain any kind of control, the British had to occupy the high ground. Hilltops were manned by riflemen to keep an eye on hostile tribes, and when a village was seen as hostile and captured, it was often destroyed, and a trail of destroyed homes, watchtowers, and water channels was left behind. Even something simple like building roads had become complicated. For the British, roads were important for trade and connectivity. They thought that this will help the tribes progress socially and curb the militancy. But for the tribes, those same roads were just easier routes for the British troops to move in. So instead of calming things down, road building often made tensions even worse. By early 1919, things inside Afghanistan had become pretty tense. Amanullah Khan had just taken power, and holding on to it was proving to be difficult for him. There was pressure from conservative groups, and the unrest within the court itself created a difficult situation for the Amir. And when leaders find themselves in such tense situations, they often tend to look outward. At the same time, British government in India was already on edge, especially after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. There was a lot of unrest, anger, and a general sense that things weren't really under control. Instead of waiting for things to settle down, Amanullah Khan decided to act fast. He ordered his forces to push towards British India in the hopes of strengthening his own position back home, and thus began the Third Anglo-Afghan War. In 1919, the Afghan regular army was not a very formidable force by conventional standards. It was able to muster roughly 50,000 troops, organized into 21 cavalry regiments and 75 infantry battalions, with about 280 modern artillery pieces. However, the real strength of the Afghan side lay beyond the regular army. Their leadership could also draw upon a large number of tribal fighters, potentially up to 80,000 tribesmen from the frontier regions. These were men familiar with the terrain and accustomed to irregular warfare, which significantly strengthened Afghanistan's overall position. Amanullah Khan had raised three armies planned for his invasion of British India through a three-pronged attack. The first force was assembled and led by Saleh Muhammad Khan and consisted largely of Muhammad and Afridi tribesmen. Its objective was to advance to the Khyber Pass and seize Peshawar. This plan was expected to coincide with attempts to trigger unrest within Peshawar itself, supported by Mahmud Tarzi and other elements linked to Indian revolutionary groups. The second army was led by Nadir Khan, who began raising an army in Khost. His objective was to invade Waziristan and advance as far as Kurram, which were former territories of Afghanistan that were ceded to the British during the creation of the Durand Line. The third force, under Abdul Quddus Khan, was assembled in Kandahar. From there, it was intended to advance into Baluchistan and extend Afghan control along that frontier. On the British side, the northwest frontier was already heavily militarized. The region had 3 infantry divisions and 2 cavalry brigades deployed, with an additional infantry division and cavalry brigade held in reserve by General Headquarters in India. From this, the British organized a striking force of 2 infantry divisions supported by 2 cavalry brigades, primarily focused on the Khyber front, but flexible enough to be deployed toward the Tochi and Kurram sectors if required. Beyond the regular army, there were also 3 frontier brigades, along with a mix of frontier militia and irregular units. These forces were crucial in holding the more difficult terrain, where conventional formations often struggled to operate effectively. The British also held a clear advantage in technology and coordination. The use of motor transport and wireless communication gave them far better command and control over dispersed units. Armored cars were essential for mobility and firepower, while the Royal Air Force, particularly No. 31 and No. 114 squadrons, extended the British reach well beyond what ground forces alone could achieve. Despite these advantages, the opening of the war exposed a critical vulnerability in the British defenses. British Indian intelligence had in fact picked up signs of a possible Afghan offensive. But after nearly 2 decades of relative calm, there was a sense of complacency. The prevailing assumption was that Afghanistan would not initiate hostilities, and as a result, any intelligence reports of an Afghan offensive were dismissed. So, when the Afghan attack finally did come, it caught the British completely off guard. It was a sudden and unexpected escalation, often described as a bolt from the blue. The conflict formally began on 3rd May 1919 when Afghan troops crossed the frontier at the western end of the Khyber Pass and moved quickly to capture the town of Bagh. The town of Bagh was strategically important to the British as it provided the water supply to Landi Kotal, which was a garrison town housing 2 companies of Sikh and Gurkha soldiers. The British response followed soon after. On 6th May, the British Indian government officially declared war on Afghanistan and ordered a general mobilization of both British and Indian troops. Reinforcing Landi Kotal became an immediate priority. The 2 companies already stationed there were exposed, and additional troops needed to be brought in quickly. So, on 7th May, the 2nd Battalion of Somerset Light Infantry was moved forward. However, they were transported through the Khyber Pass in a secret convoy of 37 lorries. This clandestine movement was designed to avoid drawing attention while strengthening the position. At the same time, the British also turned to Peshawar, where there were growing concerns about unrest and the possibility of an uprising. The British imposed a cordon around the city and issued firm demands to the residents to hand over those leading any potential rebellion. Amid threats that the city's water supply would be cut, the inhabitants complied, and by dawn on 8th May, the situation in the city was under control, and the threat of an uprising was abated. At the same time, additional reinforcements began to arrive, and the position at Landi Kotal steadily strengthened. The garrison grew to brigade size, with the arrival of the 1st Infantry Brigade under Brigadier G.D. Crocker. This gave the British a more substantial force to work with as they prepared to push back. By 9th May, British and Indian troops launched a counterattack against the Afghan forces that had captured Bagh the previous week. But the operation didn't go as planned. During the attack, the brigade commander made the decision to split his force, detaching nearly half of them to secure his flank. That decision proved costly. Without sufficient concentration of force, the attack lost momentum and ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. At the same time, the conflict was beginning to extend beyond the ground. In a parallel development, 3 BE-2C aircrafts from the Royal Air Force carried out a bombing raid on Dhaka in Afghanistan, targeting a group of hostile tribesmen. It was a small operation, but it marked the growing role of air power in the campaign. Following the initial setback, the British began to build up their strength more systematically. The 2nd and 3rd Infantry Brigades of the 1st Infantry Division were moved in from Naushera and Abbottabad, concentrating their forces at Jamrud and Kachagari. At the same time, the 6th Brigade from the 2nd Infantry Division advanced from Rawalpindi to Peshawar, primarily to stabilize the situation there and help suppress any unrest. With reinforcements in place, the British prepared for a second attempt to retake Bagh. This came on 11th May, just 2 days later, with a coordinated attack led by the 1st and 2nd Infantry Brigades under Major General Fowler. The attack was heavily supported with 22 machine guns and 18 artillery pieces brought into position. Before the infantry moved in, there was 30-minute preparatory bombardment designed to weaken Afghan defenses and disrupt their positions. The attack was carried out by the 2nd Battalion of the North Staffordshire Regiment along with 2 battalions from the 11th Gurkhas. They charged into Afghan positions with bayonets and the Afghan forces were forced to give ground, retreating into the lower Khyber where they were subjected to further indirect fire from mountain guns that had been set up for the ambush. As the Afghan forces were pushed back across the border, the British did not stop at the frontier. The Royal Air Force followed them and carried out a series of bombing runs as they retreated. The rout was total and tribesmen that might have otherwise have been expected to counterattack in support of the Afghans decided against doing so, instead turning their efforts to looting the battlefield and gathering the arms and ammunition that the retreating Afghans had left behind. On 13th May, British and Indian troops moved forward and took control of the western Khyber without facing any opposition and occupied Dhaka. But despite this advance, the situation was far from secure. The British camp at Dhaka had been poorly positioned for defense, and it soon came under sustained long-range artillery fire from Afghan artillery. The Amir followed this up with infantry assault on the position. That attack, however, was repelled. The British responded with a counterattack the following day, attempting to stabilize and push forward, but they were unable to consolidate their hold immediately. It took several more days of pressure before the situation finally settled. By 17th May, the area was secure and Afghan forces withdrew, bringing this phase of fighting to a close. Meanwhile, the previous day, British and Indian forces had launched an attack on Stonehenge Ridge, where an Afghan force of about 3,000 men had established themselves with a number of artillery pieces and machine guns. The attack began with a preparatory bombardment intended to weaken the Afghan defenses before the infantry moved in. Following that, troops from the 11th Sikh Regiment led the initial assault. But early on, things didn't go as planned. By around 0800 hours in the morning, the assault had to be halted because the troops had run out of ammunition. Resupply efforts were carried out and ammunition finally reached the front and the assault was relaunched at around 1400 hours. By this point, the conditions had become far more difficult. The troops were now exposed to the full heat of the day. Despite that, another artillery barrage was called in and the Sikhs pushed forward once again, advancing up the ridge under intense conditions. This time, they had managed to reach the top, pressing all the way to the escarpment. But when they got there, they found that the Afghan forces had already withdrawn. They had abandoned their positions and left behind much of their equipment, including artillery pieces. The cost, however, had not been insignificant. British and Indian forces suffered 22 killed and 157 wounded during the assault. Afghan losses were estimated to be much heavier, around 200 killed and 400 wounded. By 23rd May, the situation had begun to shift again, and this time it was not in the favor of British. Their posts around the Kurram Valley had to be abandoned, a clear indication of how much pressure Afghan forces were exerting in that sector. The following day, the British attempted to respond by using Handley Page bombers and carried out an air raid on Kabul. It was a bold move, taking the war directly to the Afghan capital, but in practical terms, it did little to change the situation on the ground. If anything, the pressure along the frontier continued to build and the supply situation at Landi Kotal had grown worse than before. The center of the conflict, particularly around the Kurram region, remained a serious concern. Afghan forces there were under the command of General Nadir Khan, and he commanded a substantial force, around 14 battalions. In contrast, the British position at Thal, led by Brigadier General Alexander Eustace, was far weaker. They had just 4 battalions, made up largely of inexperienced Indian troops, many of them still young recruits. Seeing that the situation was deteriorating for the British and seeing an opportunity, Nadir Khan decided to attack Thal. On 29th May, the British managed to repel an initial infantry assault, but the pressure didn't ease. The very next day, the garrison came under a heavy and sustained bombardment from Afghan artillery. At that point, the British had little choice but to reinforce the sector. They ordered the movement of the 16th Infantry Division, comprising of the 45th and 46th Infantry Brigades, from Lahore to Peshawar. The plan was to stabilize the situation and then push forward, advancing towards Jalalabad and eventually reinforcing the Kurram front. As reinforcements began to move in, part of the division was held back to defend Kohat. The main effort to relieve Eustace's force at Thal came from the 45th Infantry Brigade, led by Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, the very officer at the center of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Dyer's column was relatively small. It included just one British battalion of the London Regiment, along with units of Dogras, Punjabis, and Gurkhas. On 1st June, as they advanced towards Thal, flanking it from northern and southern approaches, they ran into resistance. A tribal blocking force had positioned itself to cut off both the approaches. Dyer attacked both ends with his artillery, while sending his infantry against the southern approach. Unable to withstand the attack, the tribesmen retreated, and as a result, the way through Eustace's garrison was cleared. On 2nd June at dawn, Dyer's brigade launched an attack on the Afghan regulars that were positioned away to the west of Thar. As the Afghan forces started their retreat, Dyer continued his attack and followed them up with cavalry and armored cars from 37th Lancers, while the RAF, using machine guns and iron bombs, attacked and dispersed about 400 tribesmen that were in the area and which posed a threat of counterattack. On 3rd June, the Afghan camp at Yusuf Khail was seized by two platoons, including two troops from the 37th Lancers, supported by a section of guns from the 89th Battery. The operation was swift and effective, further reinforcing British control in the area. But even as these actions were unfolding on the ground, the broader situation was beginning to shift. In fact, a few days earlier, on 29th May, Amanullah had already sought an armistice. His own commanders had repeatedly been hesitant, but the request was eventually agreed upon and formally sent to the British Indian government on 31st May. The issue, however, was that this message had not yet reached those actively engaged in the fighting. On the ground, it wasn't clear whether the ceasefire request was genuine or simply a tactical move by Nadir Khan to buy time. Dyer, operating under that uncertainty, chose not to take any risks, and when he received communication from Afghan side, his response was blunt. My guns will give an immediate reply, but your letter will be forwarded to the divisional commander. Shortly after he received the formal orders to halt his advance, the armistice had come into effect that very day. And just like that, after weeks of rapid movement and intense engagements, the ceasefire was put into place and the Third Anglo-Afghan War came to an end.